Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes out over on the YouTube channel every Friday. So today we're doing a Kung Pao chicken recipe that I had written a little while back for the channel. I think that was back in like December or January or so, which is a part of a larger series that we've been doing where we've been hacking a lot of food that come from like really classic Chinese American foods. So this is a really interesting one to do because the Kung Pao chicken doesn't really have a specific recipe. It has a couple of things that you kind of have to throw into it, but mostly it's just kind of whatever vegetables are in your fridge sort of thing. So we're going to dive into a couple of the things that are coming from the recipe and a couple of things where I'm sort of deviating from it, and also a few things that I'm adding that are going to give it a little bit of kind of a kick to it that probably are things that you generally wouldn't find in a Kung Pao chicken. So let me know if you have any questions I'll be here. Let me know if you have any questions. I don't know everything about Kung Pao chicken, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. If you're looking for those recipes, they already always live over on the YouTube channel. So if you're watching on Reddit, that's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, that's the channel you're already on. Yay. Cool. So for as with pretty much every stir fry that I've ever done, I want to say, I'm starting off by crushing and mincing. This is 4 cloves of garlic. And then what you'll notice that I'm doing is I actually didn't do that mince. Mostly what I did was I just gave it a really, really good crush. And then from there, I'm really just making sure that everything is nice and sliced up. So it isn't technically minced if you take a closer look. It's really just rough chopped and then crushed really well. So with garlic, because garlic is super fragile, I generally don't really bother doing that fine mince anymore because I found that you don't really need to. It's not really going to make that much of a difference. Once it's in the wok fry, it's all just going to come apart anyway. So it's not a huge deal if you don't remember or don't take the time to do that really, really thorough fine mince because once it hits that oil, once it starts blooming out its fragrant qualities in that oil, it's not going to make a huge difference anyway. With our ginger, with our ginger though, unlike garlic, ginger is a very, very durable root veggie. So if we were to do the same thing with this ginger, it would absolutely be present and be a little bit awkward unless we intended to do it. So for ginger, we do actually have to do that fine mince because otherwise it won't come apart in that wok fry the same way that garlic does. So what I like to do is usually I will start by giving it a quick mince or giving it a quick peel with the back of a spoon. Then we're going to go for our, you could call this a dice, by giving it slices down the center, one down the middle, and then giving it a quick chop. And then from there, if you wanted to stop there, that would essentially be a dice. But for our fine minces, what we're going to do is run our knife through it, like so. And then I always say, generally, if you're trying to get a fine mince and not having a good experience doing your fine mince, probably means that your knife is not sharp enough. So for this part, you want to really make sure that that knife is super sharp, otherwise these fine minces, they can take forever. And that is our fine mince on our ginger. Yeah, how's it going? Oh, how do I take care of my wood cutting board? Good question, yeah. I've experimented with a bunch of different things. I have tried a bunch of different like chemicals and like stuff that you can buy in the store, like weatherproofing, things like that. But what I discovered is that it's mostly about just making sure that the wood doesn't crack, which has actually happened to me once before, and it really sucks when it cracks because you have to do a lot of things to take care of or fix the wood when it starts splitting. So what it's really about though is just making sure that it stays well hydrated. So if the board starts drying out or if it starts swelling too much, then it will start cracking. So usually what I do in order to just sort of keep the board in like good condition is like every once in a while, I don't do this super often, but especially if I notice that the board is not looking so hot or it's sort of like looking kind of dried out, I'll give it like a good coating. I'll take a paper towel and then I'll coat that paper towel in some olive oil, and then I'll coat the board in a little bit of that olive oil, and that will just sort of like condition it a little bit, kind of same way that you would do if you were using one of those chemical conditioners. Those are the sorts of things that you would use for like patio furniture and stuff. That's basically what that stuff is doing. It's just creating a little bit of conditioning for your wood. But so that's essentially doing the exact same thing, but with olive oil, which means that it's a nice natural thing. So obviously, obviously the main concern anytime that we're working on a wood cutting board is that the wood is very porous, which means that anything that you're rubbing into it, so if you're rubbing a chemical compound to give it a good hydration, that means that that chemical compound that you're rubbing into it is probably going to come onto whatever it is that you're chopping onto your cutting board. So the goal, the objective really is to make sure that we're not rubbing off any kind of like weird junk that goes into our food. So what I like to do is just stick with olive oil because I don't mind olive oil coming off into my food. But anything else that's kind of like chemical based, that kind of makes me a little bit concerned. So I usually just avoid that stuff. But the olive oil, it seems to do the trick. If you do notice, so this did happen to me once when I wasn't really taking very good care of the cutting board, where the board started warping, which is a real bummer. The board starts warping. If it's bad enough and the board is cheap enough, that might even be a situation where you just throw out the cutting board and go find yourself a new one. My cutting board, it warped pretty bad, but I didn't really want to have to throw it out. So what I ended up doing is I took some sandpaper and I had to even the board out again. And so what happens when your cutting board starts warping and you have an uneven surface, it becomes a problem with things like green onions, for example, where you're chopping downward. But what will happen when your board is uneven, if it's warped, is when your knife hits the bottom of the cutting board, it won't make solid contact with whatever it is that you're chopping. If you're chopping something really fine, like for example a green onion, so you go downward, and then it might not actually cut all the way through, which is a real big problem if you're doing something really fine. So what I usually do, if that does happen, first of all, if it does happen, your board is really cheap, and you don't mind throwing it out, you might actually just go ahead and throw it out. Go buy yourself a new cutting board. If you have a really nice cutting board though, and you don't want to throw it out, get some like really rough grit sandpaper, and then give it a good sanding to make sure everything is really, really even. So this surface has got to be flat, otherwise you're gonna have a hell of a time trying to cut things. It sucks. So I did that once, and that was when I learned the lesson of take good care of your wood cutting boards, otherwise you're gonna regret it in the long run. Good question though. So that was my aromatics that I just talked all the way through. So that was my garlic. We could take a look. Here's my garlic, followed by my ginger, which we also fine minced. Then what we have here is our whites of our green onions, just the whites on this part. And these are going to go into our wok fry very, very first. And that's going to be what we call the aromatic elements of our wok fry, for the obvious reason that they are aromatic. And then the last thing, which we separated into a different plate, these are the greens of our green onions. So we're setting these aside. These are going to hit our finished dish at the very, very end. We're going to keep those raw so they don't kind of wilt. Then at this point from here, a kung pao chicken, what you will probably notice. So there are only a couple of very, very mandatory things that go into a kung pao chicken. The first obviously is chicken. The other two, probably that garlic and ginger. But from there, I guess the last thing is you've got to have peanuts in your kung pao chicken. But from there, you could really throw in a bunch of different kinds of things. So very often, today what we're going to be using is this red bell pepper and then half of a sweet white onion. But if you don't have those things, you could use a number of other things which will work out really well. You could use things like, well, this bell pepper looks crazy inside. That's not so great. You could use a number of different things. You could use celery. I think the original recipe I used a little bit of celery at one point. That's a really great filler ingredient. You could use onions. You could probably throw in bok choy. That would be really fun. Really anything that you have in mind that you could use broccoli. That would be a really good one. Anything that would fit into a wok fry would be really great. So today we're going to be using onions and bell pepper because I happen to have them. But whatever is in your refrigerator, it will probably go out well. What we want to do though is separate our veggies by the quality that they have about how they cook. So our bell peppers, we're chopping these first and we're giving them a large dice. And the main reason what we want to pay attention to when we work with our bell pepper, well, there's a couple of things. The first thing that you'll notice that I'm doing is I'm pulling out all of this white membrane, or as much as I possibly can. That white membrane, as you sort of like start cooking your bell pepper, it gets really, really bitter because it's part of like the unripened part of the bell pepper. So if you eat that white membrane, it won't be the end of the world, especially if you're going to wok fry like we're doing right now. But we want to do our best to avoid throwing that white membrane into our finished dishes, because it's going to cause like a little bit of a bitter aftertaste for our bell peppers, which is not so great. Because we generally want from our bell peppers more of a sweet and like crispy quality to it. Then what we're going to do here is I'm slicing these up on a large dice like so, and setting them aside. These are going to be, in today's stir fry, probably the most durable veggie, so they're going to go in relatively early because they will take the most amount of time to cook. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the other vegetable that we're using is our sweet white onion, which looks like so. Whoa. That's weird. I think my knife is dull. Anyway, the other end of our spectrum is our sweet white onion. And in this case, our sweet white onion, it's super, super delicate, just like any other onion. Which means that we want to treat it on the exact opposite of how we're going to treat our bell pepper. So we're going to give that bell pepper a couple minutes head start ahead of our onion, because this onion is super delicate. And if you're not careful, if you throw your onions in too early, they will absolutely just sort of disintegrate. Because what we want to remember anytime that we're working with onions is that an onion is mainly made up of water. It's mostly just water. So as you cook it, that water starts coming out, and then once that water starts coming out in your wok fry, you will eventually end up with just like onion mush, because all of the water will evaporate out of your onion, which is basically what, like, as you like sort of deconstruct an onion, if you cook it for long enough, that's basically what's happening. This onion's kind of old. So what we want to do, I'm going to do a similar large dice. We're going for a similar size. But what we're going to do is we're going to hold back this onion until the very, very end. It will be the last thing that gets into our wok fry. And then you'll notice what I just did is I just saved the root end of my onion. I kept that on until the very, very end, and then we're just going to toss that bit. And what's happening with that onion, I mentioned this a lot lately. With that root end is it's keeping the onion together as I dice, so it helps us get this nice even dice going. Didn't do the greatest job of. But you'll notice, so our onion has this nice, very, very even chop to it. And that's what we're looking for when we're dicing onions, is we want to make sure that this stuff is cut evenly. So if it breaks down, and if it's not cut evenly, if you have larger pieces and then smaller pieces, eventually what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a very uneven cook. So if your onions are chopped unevenly, or they're also going to cook unevenly. Not great. We want to do this? Yeah, let's do this. Next up is our chicken. Today we're working with some chicken breast. Probably the only reason I want to say that we're using chicken breast today is because I ran out of chicken thighs, so we're using chicken breast. So that's really it. You could use either, both will work just fine. I know that this chicken breast, I can tell you that I have done this recipe with chicken breast before, and it's going to work just fine. But mainly, the main reason that I usually would prefer using chicken thighs, because that chicken thigh has a little bit more fat in it, and it kind of adds a little bit of thickness and cohesiveness to our finished dish, which is a little bit useful if we want to add a little bit of extra fat to our dish. With chicken breast, it's going to work just fine. It's not going to really cause that much trouble. But we just want to remember that anytime that we're working with chicken breast and we're subbing it out for something that should be using chicken thigh, is that we're going to be adding a little bit less fat to our dish. So we've got a much leaner cut of chicken, which means that as we start cooking, you're probably going to notice that things are drying up a little bit faster. You're not rendering quite as much fat, so you might need a little bit more oil than you're used to. Things like that will start happening, which is happening because you're using chicken breast instead of chicken thigh. Otherwise, though, they both come from the same cut of the animal, or not the same cut, but they come from the same animal. So they pretty much taste the same. The chicken thigh, it comes from dark meat, so it might technically have a little bit more sodium to it, but honestly, when I eat them side by side, they taste the same to me. So I'm giving this a similar large dice as our vegetables. What you'll notice that I did a little bit earlier, though, I also sliced off the tips of our chicken breast. So the main problem that you will generally come across when you're working with something like a chicken breast is that it has uneven shapes and sizes to it. That's kind of a little bit annoying. when you're working with chicken breast, because what will happen is those larger tips and that, or like that narrower tip end to that chicken breast, what's going to happen is it's eventually going to start cooking unevenly at that part where it sort of gets really, really narrow and sort of tapers off. That's eventually going to burn, which is not super ideal. So what I like to do when I work with chicken breast is cut that little tip end off and then slice that into a larger piece of chicken, which will help make sure that we don't have an uneven cook on that chicken. All right. Cool. So that's our chicken. We're going to do a real quick marinade. This is one of the more complicated marinades that I've done in a while. This is going to be starting out with 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Followed by 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine. Shaoxing wine, if you're not familiar, is a Chinese cooking wine. It is very similar to dry cooking sherry, so honestly, if you can get your hands on a good quality dry cooking sherry, it's probably going to be better than Shaoxing wine, because a lot of the Shaoxing wine that you'll come across, at least here in the States, especially if you find it in like Chinatown, it's got a bunch of additives to it. It probably contains a lot of sugar and just generally a lot of weird stuff that's going into it, which is not necessarily the greatest. And if you have a source for really good Shaoxing or dry cooking sherry, it's probably going to taste better, and even more accurately, probably like more close to what you would generally find in the recipes that you're trying to attempt. I don't really care, but I personally don't really care, and have not really gone out of my way to find like really, really high quality dry cooking sherry. But also Shaoxing wine, if you can find it, it's only like about $2 if you find it in stores in Chinatown. So next up, that was a tablespoon of sesame oil and 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce. Followed finally by our dry ingredients. This is going to be half a teaspoon of white pepper. And then finally half a teaspoon of cornstarch. So by far the most important thing in our marinade that we're using today is going to be that cornstarch. It's really, really important. And generally, anytime that you see me using raw meat in a wok fry, you will probably see me using that cornstarch. And the reason for that, it's not because it creates any kind of lacing. I guess it creates a little bit of laciness. But what it's really doing is it's adding that starch to our marinade, and it's going to coat the chicken in that starch. What that will do is it sort of slows down the exterior cook time of our chicken just a little bit, by about like 30-45 seconds. So just long enough so that the interior of our chicken can catch up. So without it, very often what I have found is that in order to make sure that the chicken cooks all the way through, we end up overcooking the exterior of the chicken, and it kind of gets you to this like really rubbery quality of chicken, where it's basically the exterior of the chicken has overcooked because you were waiting for the interior of that chicken to cook. So you will see me using that stuff in pretty much any kind of meat marinade. I also like things like scrambled eggs, really anything that's kind of delicate and is probably going to overcook in a really aggressive wok fry, like the one we're doing. All right, last up, what we're going to do is our sauce base here. So we're going to start with, this is again 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Almost ran out. Then next up is 2 tablespoons of black vinegar. If you can't get your hands on black vinegar, I recommend getting your hands on some black vinegar. But if you can't, though, it is very similar to rice vinegar. You could just use rice vinegar if you have to. It does have a little bit of extra sweetness to it. It's more of like a malted sweet quality to it. So what I usually recommend, if you can't get your hands on black vinegar, is a little bit of extra brown sugar that will kind of compensate for that lack of malted sweetness. Next up, that's 2 tablespoons of fish sauce, followed by, how much? Yeah, 2 tablespoons of black bean sauce. Black bean sauce, if you're keeping track, is probably the big ingredient that doesn't belong in this wok fry. It's also the thing that kind of stands out to me the most as like the defining element to the flavors of our wok fry today. More commonly, you would come across it in dishes, in Chinese noodle dishes. So things like jjajangmian and other like really, really heavy, like umami forward Chinese wok fries. You'll very often see that black bean sauce. Next up is just a single tablespoon of brown sugar. Just a little bit of extra sweetness that we're not quite going to get from our fish sauce in hoisin, I guess. And then finally, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of spicy chili crisp, or you might also see it referred to as lao gan ma. Lao gan ma is often colloquially referred to as spicy chili crisp. What it really is red chili flake that has been really, really slow cooked and fried for a super long time in oil. So it's this very, very oily heat where all of that capsaicin from that chili is leaching off into that oil. So if you just use that oil, you get this really, really subtle but really, really pervasive heat because it kind of just spreads everywhere because it's included into that oil. What's special about black vinegar? Yeah, good question. So black vinegar, I actually don't know why it's black, but mainly the main difference to me, so if you've ever had rice vinegar, actually rice vinegar is also very similar to just plain old distilled white vinegar. The big difference obviously is because it comes from rice. Black vinegar also comes from rice, but mainly what we're getting out of it is it has a little bit of extra malted sweetness to it. So it's kind of like, I believe some of it, if you buy like the really cheap stuff, they might even add a little bit of molasses to it. And that extra bit of sweetness is coming from that. I can't recall off the top how it organically becomes sweeter. I believe it has something to do with the fermentation process. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're looking for is a little bit of extra sweetness, but it's a really interesting form of sweetness that I like to do. So the whole goal of the recipe that we're cooking through right now, the original recipe that I had done is over on the YouTube channel. We did 2 different versions. So the first version was from Panda Express. I actually have it in front of me. And it had a bunch of brown sugar. So the original Panda Express version that we did, it used, I think, a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. So you'll notice that today what we just used, that was only a single tablespoon of brown sugar. And what I did in order to sort of create a more interesting layer of sweetness is I removed a bunch of that sugar and then replaced it with things that have sweet qualities but are not necessarily just really straightforward sugar. So I'm pretty sure that I found the original Panda Express Kung Pao chicken once, I think, and I think that it used just straight white sugar. So the things that we're replacing some of that sweetness with today, that's that fish sauce, the Shaoxing wine, and that black vinegar. All 3 of those have interesting qualities of sweetness to it. They're not just bright syrupy sweetness. They're interesting umami based sweetness. So the fish sauce has the sweetness that's coming from fermentation. That black vinegar has more of a malted quality to it, and that Shaoxing wine is a really bright sweetness that's coming from alcohol. So what we're trying to do is replace some of that really brunt sweetness with more of a complex quality to it. Yeah, totally. I'm glad you learned something new. Usually, if you're looking for it, you can find it in most Asian stores, especially if you live near Chinatown. You can find it in most Chinese grocery stores. It will be somewhere close to the black soy sauce or dark soy sauce. You'll find it next to most of those things. So be careful with it, though. It is really, really concentrated. So when you use that stuff, don't overdo it because it will absolutely overtake a whole dish real quick. All right. Next up, what we're going to do is assemble our cornstarch slurry, which I very often forget to do before we start cooking. So I did finally remember to do it before we start cooking. Cornstarch slurry, as the name implies, this is just 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, which we're going to combine with a little bit of water. Cold water. Sorry. Real important. It seems like a really small detail, but very, very important when you're making that cornstarch slurry like this, is that it's got to be done with cold water. If you use warm water or if you use hot water, what will happen is that the cornstarch will start cooking, and then you'll get this really gelatinous quality to it, which is not fun. You basically have to throw it out and start again. So I have messed up this cornstarch slurry more ways than I can count at this point. It seems really simple, like a really dumb thing to mess up, but it is super, super easy to mess up. Oh, you don't think there's an Asian grocery store? Oh, that's all right. You can find that stuff on the internet too. Like the pantry stable stuff, you can find that on Amazon super easy. Like all of that, like the black vinegar, the Shaoxing wine, maybe not fish sauce because that's not really pantry stable, but like lao gan ma, sambal, like all of those things that they're really pantry stable, if they don't have to be refrigerated, is really easy to find online. For sure, it's a lot easier if you can find it somewhere local. Amazon has everything, yeah. Well, that's not so. Almost everything, but like a lot of times, there's a couple of things that I can't find. So I live in Chinatown here in Oakland, which means that like I didn't realize that this was that much of a problem. But if it's not used in Chinese cooking, it's really hard to find here. So like things like gochujang, which is a very, very common ingredient in Korean cooking, or even like miso paste, another really, really common one that comes from Japanese cooking. Galangal root has been a big one that I've been looking for. It's used as super, super common ingredient in Thai food. A lot of these things, they're really, really common in Asian cuisine, but they're not super common, or they don't ever come up in Chinese food. And I have so much trouble finding these ingredients. Yeah, I oftentimes will like go on Amazon looking for those things. But what I have discovered as I sort of like search for these things on the internet is that things that aren't pantry stable, so like galangal root, kaffir lime leaves, stuff like those are the big two that I've been looking for lately. Fish sauce is really hard to find. Gochujang is really expensive actually on Amazon because it actually has to be refrigerated. I didn't know this. Anything that's not pantry stable, stuff like that, it gets really, really difficult to find on the internet, which makes it really useful to find a store locally. But yeah, definitely that's like a big part of like the thing. Actually, that's a big part of the things that we kind of talk through in the recipe videos is like how to sub out some of these things because I know a lot of the recipes that we're doing are like using ingredients that are not super common. All right. Last up, the last thing that I just finished doing. This is just a little bit of Tianjin peppers. Tianjin peppers, if you're not familiar, they're dry peppers. So they're very, very dry. What we're going to do is throw that into our wok fry while the wok is empty. It's not going to be at the very beginning, but it's going to be at the second batch cook. Stupid camera. We're going to throw those in relatively early because what we're going to try and do is bloom out a lot of that capsaicin that lives in the pepper. That's going to be really useful. It's going to give us this really interesting and really, really mellow form of heat. So those Tianjin peppers, you'll kind of see them a lot in a lot of Chinese cuisine. They'll use a whole bunch of these. So I've seen like fried chicken dishes where like the plate is like layered with this stuff first, so it's like the thing that goes underneath the fried chicken. But if you don't use it properly, you won't get anything out of it. It looks like things are really, really spicy, but if it's not actually bloomed properly, it doesn't actually do anything. So like lots of times, it's just sort of like an indicator that things are gonna be really spicy sometimes. But you have to treat them very specifically. If you don't use them properly, they don't taste like anything. They're gonna be really pretty, but that's about it though. Last up, this is a little bit of raw peanuts. Nothing special about these, they're just raw peanuts. We're gonna toast those right before our wok fry, and things will get nice and crispy. All right. Cool, I think that's it for prep. Let's head over to our cutting board or stove. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, yeah. Cool. Yeah, hopefully you find one someday. Yeah, exactly. Cool. So that's all of our prep. We've got my cutting board, or I've got my wok heating up over here. I probably should have started that earlier. Anytime that we're cooking in a wok, that thing's got to be very, very hot before we start cooking. So I usually like to give it, that will probably be hot within like 30 seconds or so. But I usually like to overshoot it and kind of like give it a little bit of extra time, maybe about a minute or so. Probably the big thing that we're looking for, or that we're going to do today, is so a kung pao chicken has a lot of ingredients to it. So it has all of those bell peppers, those onions, that chicken, those Tianjin peppers, all of these things we've just finished chopping. All of them are going to contribute to the like a wide array of things that need to be cooked in that wok fry. So that means that we have to cook things very, very specifically in order to navigate the amount of things that are going into the fry. So we're going to do a thing or a process in wok cooking that we call batch cooking, which you will see done in a lot of home-cooked wok frying. Because what's going to happen is if we were to try and add all of these things to the wok at once, it would kind of create this lower temperature to the wok, and you would end up with more of like a stir-fry stew. Things would kind of like get really, really mushy, more like an oatmeal quality. So if you've ever had a wok fry or a stir-fry that's sort of like kind of mushy, kind of looks like old cereal, that's becoming because the wok wasn't staying hot enough as you were cooking. So what we're going to do in order to make sure that wok stays nice and hot is we're going to cook certain ingredients and then pull them out, and then cook our next ingredient and then pull that out. And then at the very, very end, we're going to add everything back to the wok. And at the very end, that's the only time where everything will be in the wok. So that's kind of ensuring that as we cook things, there's only one point in time where everything is in the wok, which means that every time that we're cooking something new, the wok is nice and hot. So let's take a look. I'm starting off, once our wok is nice and hot, this is 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. And then we're going to give our wok our long yao, which is essentially coating that wok in cold oil. This is creating our non-stick surface on anything that's carbon steel, really. Then I'm starting off with my aromatics first. That's my garlic, followed by my ginger. And finally, the whites of my green onions. Just the whites. Those are a little bit more durable than the greens of your green onions. So they can withstand that wok fry a little bit better. And then what I like to do is we want to bloom those until they become fragrant. So usually for me that's about 10 seconds. But at this point I really like to stress is you want to use your nose at this point. It depends on like how hot the wok is, how much garlic you chop, a lot of things. You want to start smelling at this point. Then we're going to add our chicken here, but I'm going to be careful, relatively careful, to hold back as much of this liquid as possible. So you'll notice in my marinade bowl, there's a lot of liquid going on. That's all like that soy sauce, that Shaoxing wine, the oils. All of those things are contributing to the liquidy qualities of our marinade. So what we want to do is be careful not to drop all of that liquid in, because if we do, a couple of things are going to happen. The main thing that's going to happen is that oil is going to start splattering really aggressively. And that's because hot oil combined with cold liquid, that's going to create splatter. And that's basically the process of all of that liquid evaporating. So, not necessarily not necessarily a great thing to do, but what we want to do is hold back as much of that liquid marinade. For the other reason, because it's also, if it ends up in the wok, it's going to contribute to creating colder temperatures. So as that liquid ends up in the wok, we're going to have more and more problems keeping that wok nice and hot, because the wok is filling up with liquid. So we're trying our very, very best to hold back as much liquid in that marinade as possible. The legendary wok, yeah, I guess so, huh? All right, so you'll notice that cornstarch that we added to the marinade is starting to come into play now. If we did not have that cornstarch in our marinade, this chicken would probably be done cooking already. And that's because the high heat of the wok would have already finished cooking that exterior cook, which is, in some cases it could be fine, but in our particular case, especially since we're working with chicken breast, we really want to slow down that cook time in order to make sure that everything cooks evenly. So what we're trying to do is cook everything on that really, really high heat, but we also want it to cook evenly. So that cornstarch is very useful because it's sort of slowing down the exterior cook just long enough so that the interior of our chicken can finish cooking all the way through. Chicken is not tossing today. Yeah. Pot of coins. I have not heard that reward before. Thank you, though. All right. So we're gonna give this chicken. This will probably take maybe 2-3 minutes. Maybe another like minute or so. There we go. Now we can toss. Yeah. Cool. Hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST. With new recipes out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So if you're watching on Reddit and you haven't checked out the YouTube channel yet, definitely find your way over to the YouTubes. Lots of fun new recipes coming up. This particular Kung Pao chicken is a part of a series that we've been doing over on the YouTube channel where we've been cooking through a lot of Chinese American classics that are super fun to take a look at. And sort of like taking a look at what it would look like to reproduce some of these American classics through the lens of what like more authentic and more traditional Chinese wok frying looks like. So that's going to be a little bit interesting with things like a Kung Pao chicken because a lot of these things, they have like actual origins in like true traditional Chinese cooking. So we can kind of compare and contrast what's different. So if you haven't made your way over to the YouTube channel yet, definitely hop over there and check out what's going on. We're working our way to 4,500 subs by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Yeah, there we go. I think that's nearly there. Any dishes that I personally invented? Probably. I have to think about it. There probably are. But I have to like really think about it though. I recently did a carbonara that uses lapchong, which is a Chinese sausage, but I did not invent that. Someone actually sent it to me. I thought it was really cool though, and I might actually do a video for it if I get their permission to do it first. I have to think about it. I don't know if there's anything that I have personally invented, like dishes that I've very specifically invented myself. Although that might be fun. All right, so here's our chicken. I'm pulling this out of our wok. It is fully cooked. And then very important, the reason that we're pulling it out is because it would continue to cook at lower temperatures if we left it in, and then we would end up with like really mushy chicken. So that if our goal is today is to get that really, really crispy quality to our chicken. What we're trying to do is make sure that all of its cook happens on high heat for a very, very brief amount of time. So that was maybe cooking for no more than like maybe 2-3 minutes. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm wiping down my wok. We want to make sure that none of this stuff stays behind. Anything that stays behind is probably just going to end up burning, so we don't want to do that. A lot of the stuff that's kind of hanging behind is that like the hoisin sauce and all of that sugary qualities that are kind of laying behind from the marinade. We don't want that stuff to stick around because if it kind of just hangs out stuck to the wok, those sugars are eventually going to start caramelizing and then they're eventually going to burn. And then you're going to have burnt stuff in your wok fry, which is not super great. Yeah. Have you ever thought about using more flavor? Yeah, that's sort of like kind of the goal of the series. So I think, I don't remember exactly what I put into the Panda Express hack, but the main thing that I added that I thought was like a really interesting addition is a little bit of, we can actually take a look while this wok heats up. I'm back, there you are. What we used is a little bit of black bean sauce, which looks like this. Black bean sauce, as the name implies, is coming from the fermentation of black beans. And it's got this really, really like bright and like very, very aggressive umami quality that's coming from that, like all of that really, really distinct fermentation of black beans. So we can take a look. Whoops. Looks like this. You can tell how dark and like very, very concentrated it is. So what we use is just 2 tablespoons of it, and it gives this really, really interesting quality to our wok fry that I don't think I've ever had a Kung Pao chicken that has that kind of quality to it. Emily, where else do we stream? Yeah, so the other stream, it lives over on Reddit. So Emily is watching over on YouTube. The other stream lives over on Reddit. And we're streaming at the same time. Yeah. All right, so we have a couple more things left to wok fry. So the first thing that I'm going to do is give a quick fry to my peanuts. This is very important. Usually what I like to do is I usually like to just buy like roasted peanuts. Today we're using some raw peanuts, which do mean that they have to be cooked first. So if you're lazy, you can absolutely, what I usually like to do is buy honey roasted peanuts, and then it adds this like nice little like crispy coating to those peanuts. Since we're using raw peanuts, we don't have to do too much to it. But what I like to do is just give them a quick toast, because those raw peanuts, they're pretty chewy if you don't remember to cook them first. They don't need that much time, maybe about 30 seconds in that wok fry. And that's pretty much it for the peanuts. All right, then now that those peanuts are done, we're gonna add 4 more tablespoons of peanut oil and give our wok one more long yao. And then I'm starting off with those Tianjin peppers first. Very specifically, we want those Tianjin peppers to get into the wok while there's a whole bunch of oil and room down here for them to hit the oil. So what's gonna happen is once they hit that oil, the capsaicin that's living in those dry peppers, they're gonna start coming out, which is real nice and fragrant. And then once that's going, we can add our bell peppers. And at this point, super important, once those Tianjin peppers hit the wok, your windows and your smoke detectors got to be shut off and the windows got to be open. Because that smoke, if you're not careful and you start breathing that stuff in, it will absolutely cause a coughing fit. So super important. Get those windows open at that point. Then those are my bell peppers that I just threw in, and I like to give it a little bit of a head start. So I usually let it go for like maybe a minute before we hit those onions. Oh, Emily, yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you for donating. The Streamlabs, it's supposed to have an alert box, but the alert box doesn't work when people donate. But thank you for donating. That's super nice. If you're watching over on YouTube, you might also have noticed there's a alert or a donation bar that lives up top. I don't ever ask for money in order to stream. I don't do it for money. I just like to stream for people. Basically just cooking dinner. But what we are trying to do is I'm basically constantly trying to upgrade gear because a lot of the stuff that I use to stream is really cheap junk. So probably the thing that we're trying to replace right now are all of the capture cards that live on all of these cameras. So if you ever noticed, a couple of the cameras, they look really blurry from time to time. That's because we're using really cheap capture cards. So right now we're raising money to replace those capture cards. So if you have the means, please follow over to the Streamlabs link and donate. If you don't have the means, it's totally fine. We are doing just fine. All right, next up, those are my onions going in. And then those onions, remember, they're real delicate, so we're gonna give them maybe a minute in that wok before we move on from there. We're really trying to keep that time with the onions super brief. We want them mostly raw, but really we're just trying to cook off a little bit of rawness here. Yeah. Cool. Then that's our chicken going back into the wok. Followed by our peanuts. And then finally our sauce element. And then I like to add a little bit of extra water, maybe about a 1/4 cup or so. And that's just really going to give our sauce mixture the opportunity to really kind of become a little bit more cohesive. And then finally, I'm turning off that overhead. The reason that we can turn off that overhead, you'll notice, is that our wok is no longer really aggressively cooking anymore, which means that we don't have super, super aggressive high heat anymore. That's, in our case, totally fine because we're not cooking anything anymore. But if you do notice that happen and you're still cooking, that's probably a big bad sign, because it means that you're cooking things on low heat and you're on way to a wok fry that's going to taste like porridge, which is not fun. So last up, that was my cornstarch slurry going into the wok. And then we're giving this a quick toss. And you'll notice that once that cornstarch slurry hits the wok, that sauce goes from kind of like a liquidy quality to a much more cohesive quality. And things really start tightening up quite a bit. And that's because the starch in that cornstarch is really becoming, turning the liquid into a more cohesive sauce. What type of pan is it? Yeah, so this would be, I don't actually know the brand of it. People ask me the brand of this wok a lot, and I actually have no idea. The wok that I'm cooking on is a round-bottom carbon steel wok. So you'll notice that's the reason why it kind of rolls around like this all the time. Is because it has a rounded bottom to it. So that's really useful for all of those like really aromatic elements that we were doing earlier. So all of that like tangent pepper and the garlic and the ginger. That's really useful because what's happening is at the bottom of the wok, it's sort of rounding out, and that's kind of giving all of that oil an opportunity to just sort of pull up at that bottom. And then what's happening is once it rounds out at that bottom, we can add things to that oil and bloom out aromatic qualities. So you would probably still be able to do it in a flat bottom wok, but it would be a little bit harder, and you might actually have to use more oil. So I love using the round bottom for that purpose, basically. Pretty much the main reason why I love it. There we go. That's better. You'll notice I also just switched back on the fire briefly for about like maybe 20 seconds because it was looking a little bit loose, so I let that sauce tighten up a little bit more before we pulled it off. Let's do this over here. Looks good. Yeah, thank you. This is one of my favorite stir fries. Come on. There you go. And then finally, just like any other stir fry that we do, what we're trying to do is minimize the amount of time that all of the ingredients are cooking in that sauce. So the more time that your ingredients spend in that sauce element, the soggier they're going to become. Because essentially what's happening is once that sauce element gets into the wok, especially once we add a little bit of water or chicken stock, is things are going to start boiling. So you're basically starting to boil or blanch things. Which is not necessarily what we're trying to do. So, we want to be generally, especially if you're trying to like dilute that sauce a little bit, we want to generally be careful about adding too much liquid because you'll get into the world of you're trying to like find that quick balance between cooking it quickly, but also making sure that things don't get too loose. And then finally, the last thing that I'm doing anytime that we cook in a wok is I'm removing everything. We're giving it a real quick rinse while it's hot. And then we're going to give it one more wipe down. So this is really useful, not necessarily even just for woks, but I have started doing this pretty much with any kind of pan that I'm using that's made out of carbon steel. Is cleaning it while it's hot. That's really useful because the carbon steel has this natural non-stick quality to it that only is available when it's hot. So once it cools down, you're going to have a lot more trouble cleaning this thing because things are going to start sticking, and that's not super fun. So I have definitely got in that world of like sat down, finished eating dinner, and then came back maybe like 45 minutes later, and then tried to do this, and that's going to be a lot harder because things will have by that point caked onto the wok, which is not super fun. All right. Up. So at this point, just like anything else that you use in a cook that's not necessarily edible, remember that those tangent peppers, they're not edible at all. So if you want, you could go through and start picking them out. It kind of reminds me of like cooking with like a bay leaf or like a star anise pod, where they're not edible at all, but they do impart quite a bit of flavor because of their dried quality. So if you want, you could pick it out. I like to leave it in because it's really pretty, but it's not really doing anything else at this point. You don't want to try and eat it. It's going to be really chewy. But it does look really pretty. Then I'm finishing, that was my green onions that we're adding. How to do it. Yeah, thank you. Go. Yeah, cool. Let's give this a try. Yeah, that chicken is real tender. A really nice, like interesting, but very, very mellow heat. That's coming from a couple of the different heat sources that we're using that doesn't really have very much aggressiveness to it. So we didn't include any doubanjiang or gochujang, or even like chili flake or Szechuan peppercorn. None of those things that are really, really aggressive. Everything that we use is very, very mellow. So that lao gan ma and that tangent pepper is everything. This is very interesting, like mellow heat. And then the black bean paste gives this really, really bright and like more umami forward quality. That's complemented really nicely by all of those really sweet qualities that kind of like have this really interesting array of sweetness that's not necessarily just sugar, but it's like fermented sweetness that's coming from like fishy umami that's from the fish sauce, and like bright qualities that are coming from that Shaoxing wine and things like that. So yeah, adequately spicy black bean kung pao chicken. Yeah, that's more like it. Yeah, there's not quite like, it's not super spicy. It's just like adequately spicy. So that's that's a good, yeah, that's a good description. Cool. Thanks everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes over on the YouTube channel every Friday. So if you have not headed over to the YouTube channel yet, we've got new stuff coming out over there every Friday. So last Friday, we came out with a recipe for a Chinese crepe, which is called a jianbing. Friday before that, I believe we did Korean gimbap. And then I think before that was tomato beef chow mein, which is one of my mom's favorite chow mein. So lots of fun new recipes like that coming up soon. The particular kung pao chicken that we just finished cooking to is part of a larger series over on that YouTube channel, where we've been sort of like deconstructing a lot of the things that come from American classic Chinese food. So this particular one is coming from a hack recipe that we did based off of Panda Express's kung pao chicken. And then what we did is we kind of like deconstructed it and took it apart and then reconstructed it with things that come from like more traditional Chinese cooking. So a couple of the things that we added are probably things that you would come across in a lot of like really traditional Chinese wok frying, but not things that you would generally come across in like Panda Express, for example. So today we used that lao gan ma, that black bean sauce, and that black vinegar. All three of those things are probably not things that you'll come across in Chinese traditional or like Chinese American cuisine. So it kind of results in this like really interesting like amalgamation of things that you wouldn't necessarily find in a lot of like traditional Chinese or like a lot of Americanized Chinese wok frying. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely find your way over to the YouTube channel. We're working our way to 4,500 subs by the end of the month, so if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. What are we doing next? Next up, so we won't be here tomorrow, but next up on Thursday we're going to be doing some dajiangmian, which is a Chinese noodle dish that also very heavily relies on the use of black bean sauce, and is probably the more traditional and like more commonplace thing to use black bean sauce for. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely come find us. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Bye. find it from somebody else now. Everybody's got to go up. Sometimes funny how we shoot the mood. Still, will we fight it, baby? Alright, never mind. Then I found what I'm looking for, baby. Yes, I found it now. Alright, I'm finally in love with love, and it's bringing me down. Want to be, baby, yes, sir. Do you want to be, baby? Alright. Oh, wait now, baby. I said everybody wants to be. They still got dreams, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got dreams, but more like a token of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. Want to be, baby, yes, sir. Want to be. Say
tasty whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. Your bed warm, glass of brandy, darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time.